Cyber bad actors are more sophisticated than ever, utilizing global, multi-point strategies and the most advanced technologies to execute attacks on regulated industries, governments, businesses of every size, and citizens. Real-time information sharing about imminent, emerging, and escalating threats is critical and necessarily involves unprecedented, trusted interaction between government and business, most especially in heavily regulated industries of energy, finance, communications, and transportation. Talk about information sharing is frequent, but too often more rhetoric than substance. EDGE22 is pleased to feature a roundtable of responsible senior professionals who live this challenge daily and who have valuable insights into specific strategies to continually build trust and hence effective communication protocols between government and business. Moderating this plenary executive roundtable is EDGE22 co-chair and Vice President Chief Security Officer of Dominion Energy, Adam S. Lee. Joining Adam is Eric Barnhart, Chief Security Officer, Portland General Electric, Elizabeth Beth Capello, Deputy Chief Information Officer, Department of Homeland Security, Matt Hayden, Vice President, Cyber Client Engagement, GDIT, Carol House, Cybersecurity and Digital Innovation, SME, Brian Vorndren, Assistant Director, Cyber Division, Federal Bureau of Investigation. EDGE22 is pleased to welcome this distinguished panel for a provocative and informative discussion and exchange on practical strategies to improve collaboration and communication between government and regulated industries.
Thanks. Hey, want to be met? Carol, how are you around? Hey, great to meet you. See you. Want me to go around? Sure. Oh, yeah. Thanks.
You know what, I'm gonna tee this up the way Brian did, because I admire Brian Harrell. He's a wonderful, wonderful partner, was in CISA, and it remains now. So thank you, Brian. So when we had our roundtables in the informal sessions, I said something that I think sort of was met with unanimous approval, which was when I was in the FBI Cyber Division in 2005, the toughest thing that we had to face in sort of defining and building our mission space and being effective in the brand new nascent FBI's cyber program was having the private sector share breach information with us. Now we're in 2022, and I think the biggest thing the FBI's now developed cyber division faces is private sector sharing breach information with the FBI. So maybe I'm wrong about that. We certainly have the source here to help us with that. But so we're going to start off there is how do we get better at it? How do we develop it? How do we build trust? What does that look like? What tools are available? And that's where we're going to kick this thing off. And by the way, I know we're the last. I think we're the last or close to it. No, you're last. So, well,
yes, thank you.
But you're gonna fire this place up. So
we're gonna get cocktails for mine.
Yes. But so everybody wake up. Because I know everyone's starting to slump. So again, I'm going to start, I think, with the flag officer on deck here, Mr. Vorndren. What progress have we made since I think the division was established in 2003? Where are we now? Let's just start sort of the higher level strategic thoughts around information sharing.
Sure. I would say that, Brian Harrell and I were talking last night at dinner about this, about when CISA became an agency, the agency that we know it as today, how those initial steps were taken primarily between CISA and the FBI. Because up until that point, there were other federal agencies involved in prior incident relationship building, but really the Bureau had a bulk of that work. Primarily because there wasn't another agency to fill the net defense space. So what I think we've learned is, I'll boil it down into three key pieces. Number one is we can't have a relationship with everyone. It's simply impossible. The ecosystem of American business and multinational is just too broad. And how do we navigate a 3-person law firm who is important and has revenue at stake and family livelihood at stake when you compare and contrast that to something like Colonial Pipeline. For the FBI, that's a really hard decision because we look at everybody as partners. But I think where we've shaken out on that is essentially here. Critical infrastructure, Fortune 1000, and nation-state campaigns attacking anyone, right? That's essentially how we boil that down. The second piece that I think we've learned, and I would imagine that if CISA were here, they would say the same thing, is that we have to provide value before an intrusion, during an intrusion, and after intrusion. I was speaking to a board back in March. The board said to me, hey, we just can't tell you how much we appreciate. In this case, it was the Bureau. It could have been Secret Service for another company. It could have been CISA for another company. Continuing to engage with us about the adversary who attacked us in 2017. It's 5 years ago, but they still think about it every day. And because of that, we still brief them every quarter on the adversary. But I think that leads to trust. And we have to add value mostly through preparatory steps, which I'll talk about here this afternoon, but also through tactical intelligence sharing. And then the last piece is this. For whatever reason, my experience has been in my career that we all have a hard time admitting when we didn't do as well as we could have. And I encourage the partners that I speak to, I want a phone call if we don't hit a home run, right? I want a phone call if we're not adding value. Because without that recursive feedback loop, there will never be trust that we're all trying to grow into the ecosystem together. So that's how I would open, Adam.
So I think critical infrastructure, energy, you have a couple of representatives here, but there's probably no place where the reality that we are at some level, let's face it, you've heard the discussion to this point, throughout the conference you've heard a theme, we're at war. I mean, we're at war. However you consider it, when nation state actors, for our CSOC in Richmond, Virginia, the hailstorm of automated tools banging on the outer perimeter of our network to the tune of $1 billion a month. We are under attack. We're under constant attack. But critical infrastructure, I think, probably pales to the defense industrial sector. So Matt, why don't you talk to us about, I mean, you work in sort of a quasi-private sector classified environment. What does that look like to you? What are nation states doing to target us as a nation? How are they compromising us? What are they seeking to do?
So what you're going to find is that anybody who makes something for the government, whether they're in the Defense Department or not, has a giant bullseye. Not just a giant bullseye, but they are checking every lock on every door. And to the extent that we actually get to be a part of that value proposition, where we contribute when we're seeing people trying to kick doors in, it actually adds in that information sharing context. But as a DIB partner, we actually have a lot of constraints similar to the previous panel with regards to the energy sector, because there's a certain way you have to do everything to make sure that we're getting that risk tolerance that the government has very low. And so to be a good partner with the government means to follow their rules, and especially Defense Department rules. So at EDGE22, we have a lot of work in both the IC and DoD and DHS and all the agencies across the federal government. And some of them have their own rules and some of them don't. But to the extent that we are making sure that we are eating our own dog food and really stepping out in front of the security challenge is important for us as a company that has that mission. At the same time, to kind of see for the government to be a role model. I mean, it's arrogant to say, but at the same time, the government can't move as fast as we can. So we want to make sure that as a DIB partner, we're leveraging what we offer and getting out in front so that we can take on some of these challenges. But there's still a nation state challenge that is above our pay grade. So we still have to fall back to the federal government for things like, are you guys taking this, are you guys going to beat somebody up that beat us up from a cyber command perspective, from all of the other feeders into those campaigns? We still have to fall back to Uncle Sam and say, hey, get our back on this. We've got to make sure this type of campaign doesn't spread.
Carol, what do you think about that? I know you have a history in DoD and military and interacting with the defense industrial base. Can you talk a little bit about what those interactions look like?
Yeah, in my most recent role at the National Security Council, certainly working with the DIB was critical. But I guess overall, with all the critical infrastructure sectors, totally would echo what Brian was pointing at, the fact that we really want to figure out how to add value. In some cases, that means sharing information that we can share publicly with everyone, like the alerts that come out from NSA, FBI, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think with certain sectors, like with the DIB, that are just, there's a level of maturity, there's a level of sophistication in their partnerships and a level of sensitivity around that data. There's a partnership and collaboration that I do see that doesn't exist in all the sectors. There's a couple of others, though, like I think the financial services sector has done a lot to certainly evolve, and they share a lot of information with each other, also with the government, not all of it voluntarily, some of it reported to us through suspicious activity reports, and then other requirements to report cyber incidents. I did want to double down on that financial aspect and information, because it's one of the more interesting regulatory obligations to report any kind of cyber-enabled financial crime to FinCEN, and that's a great place that I've seen information sharing and collaboration from industry really thrive over the past couple of years related to cybercrime. Any of the information that comes to FinCEN, it benefits us and our law enforcement partners, and then we've been able to leverage, when I was at FinCEN leading our cybercrime and crypto work, we could use that information to then identify TTPs, red flag indicators that financial institutions could then use into their own programs and then provide it back out. So similar to those cyber advisories, you provide financial advisories out there. So it's that continuous loop, that feedback cycle that Brian was speaking to that was so important. So I think that we have seen improvement in information sharing from industry to government, and certainly industry across industry. I think there's more ISACs than there are sectors now. The National Council of ISACs is amazing. There were over 20 there, which is impressive since we have 16 critical infrastructure sectors. But of course, there's still a lot of reticence in certain cases where they're concerned about regulatory action, law enforcement action, just the sensitivity of their data getting breached.
Yep. Yep. So one more on that strategic level, and then we're going to start getting our hands dirty on more of the tactical stuff. Beth, talk to us about sort of intra-government sharing. And I mean, you're on the sort of, as we in our sector call the services company side, right? So you have to keep the architecture going on a massive scale. So you need that information as much as anyone. What does that look like intra-government? Because we have a bunch of government folks here.
So it's really interesting, because I'm going to key on something you said right at the beginning about your network is always being attacked. Well, I happen to run the Homeland Security Enterprise Network for the Department of Homeland Security. So I'm a little bit familiar with that. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, particularly in Homeland Security, because we do have CISA, right? They're part of us. Right. And we have a really terrific relationship where I'm running sort of the DHS environment, but I can also be a bit of a clearinghouse, sandbox, testbed, lots of things for CISA in terms of how they're relating to the rest of the government. We also offer some information sharing platforms that allow for that intragovernmental state, local, tribal, territorial partners to share information. But I think we most recently, I'll bring up SolarWinds again, we found that the partnerships across the government, I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the things we've seen happening here a lot recently is federal employees in leadership positions who have worked in multiple agencies or multiple components of agencies moving into different places. And so they've got these historical relationships. And I'll tell you frankly, during SolarWinds, we brought that to bear with Department of Justice, with our partners in VA, with our partners across DHS, the DHS components. And I think we were able to share information very quickly. However, it was ad hoc. And I think from my perspective, what I'd like to see happen is some more formalization of, at least on the government side of the house, our ability to rapidly share information. I think in my mind, the biggest challenge we face right now is the speed and how, if somebody somewhere sees something, to be able to communicate that effectively and with a sufficient level of detail to start taking action. So those are some of the areas we're working on.
So that's a great segue to my next question. But first, one of the things about the GBEF that I've noticed that's one of its greatest strengths, but it's also something I think is going to grow, is the DC, Northern Virginia focus of a lot of the members and things. So it's great having Eric here. So Eric's a new CSO with cyber responsibility at a utility on the West Coast, up in the redwoods there in Oregon. Talk to us about what information sharing looks like. What did you expect coming from large scale manufacturing, an FBI alum, and now you're in critical infrastructure? What do you see with information sharing?
Yeah. First off, I want to give a plug. Obviously, Adam already said former FBI. So again, I'll shield from my old organization. One of the things that I know, I graduated. I retired from the FBI in 2018, and I know at the time we were still knocking on corporate America's door trying to prove the value proposition. And a lot of times it was a hard sell. What the FBI has now created is a private sector coordinator, and I would encourage you all, if you haven't identified your local field office and who that private sector coordinator is, identify that person when the sun is shining. A good example recently, we brought EDGE to Portland, and he gave much the same speech, the presentation today and tomorrow that he's going to give, and it adds incredible value. Again, you're not signing on for any agreement going forward, but I think I would say that you're not leveraging something that you already pay for every April 15th if you don't bring them in and see what they can do for you. Now on to the question. Coming from manufacturing into the utility space, one of the biggest pleasant surprises has been the amount of information sharing. We're not direct competitors. I can pick up the phone and talk to Adam, who I've known for a long time, or virtually any of my counterparts around the country. How are you doing this? How did you approach this? What's your model? Everybody has shared incredibly freely. And I think it makes us better every day because it allows me to question what was built at PG. A lot of it was very good, but a lot of it, we just recently went to the converged model. There was a lot in the last panel that was very thought-provoking for me, and that's our journey as well. And now having seen it and continuing to grow that converged model, but more importantly, the converged mindset, I would really ask anybody in the audience who hasn't gone to that converged model yet, why not? And can you articulate, why you have not gone that route? Because and I'll answer your question, but I would also say all it takes is for you to run one red team exercise against your company's security, and you'll realize how quickly the physical breach leads to the cyber breach, leads to the cyber exploitation, resulting in further physical penetration. And it will convert the masses. But as far as that information sharing goes, I mean, it is being a publicly utility, you do straddle that line. And again, you have that government support, realizing the criticality of the grid, the bulk electric system, but then you also have an incredible amount of partners. It really is the best of both worlds, because there's not anybody that refuses your call, whether it be industry counterparts or former government folks.
Yeah. Everyone recognizes the critical infrastructure protection mission. Yeah. That's great. And again, the segue that I wanted to jump off from Beth was the speed of sharing. Is that the greatest weakness when you're talking about the government ecosystem responding to threat information? Is there a solution to accelerating that sharing to make it useful and timely? So I have a bias. Something that I would love to get thoughts on from the panel and maybe through questions, because it's really something that I thought was transformative for us. Credit to the great Brian Harrell, Dave Glowy, and INA at the time. We deployed CyberSentry in our network. We're the pilot. We're the first energy company to do that. It was a wrangle with the NDAs and all of the personality assessments of trust and all of that to get there. And that was the beauty of the relationship CISA had through Brian and through the leadership to really instill that trust in our leadership. It's where we have real-time DHS appliances sitting inside our perimeter in our network looking for TS/SCI level IOC information. And that is what information sharing, to me, ought to look like. Real time. How do you get there? It's not easy. And we've had many conversations with Brian, different mission focus, right? It's not a critical infrastructure protection mission that the FBI has. It's an investigative mission. And how, Brian, if we're talking about that real-time sensor data, exploiting that, sitting at the outer perimeter, looking, resolving back those IPs, who is it hitting us, escalations, geopolitical influencing, the escalations, and what are they looking for, where are they hitting us? Talk to us about that a bit.
Okay, it's a lot. What I would say is this, and I'm very, very consistent everywhere I speak, no different here today. The Bureau is one component part of this U.S. government team. And usually when I open my remarks, I say, we should take a minute to recognize, Secret Service and CISA and HSI and the Bureau and Treasury and State and NSA and Cyber Command and CIA, because they're all relevant. And there is never a day when something happens that's productive in the cyber ecosystem that it is done unilaterally, right? Because even in the case of the sensors that are deployed to collect TS/SCI, the TS/SCI is derived from other IC members in action through DHS's authorities. So, but for Cyber Command or CIA or NSA, that would never be possible. My position is this on sensor data. Adam and I have talked about this. We have deployed various types of sensors from the FBI perspective, most of them, if not all of them, under consent for the last 20 years. But as CISA has emerged, and as the administration firmed up executive order authorities and statutory authorities, the obvious question for us is this. If CISA has been earmarked with that mission space to essentially censor the .gov, the cloud, and other potential critical infrastructures Adam described, then we likely should no longer be in that space, okay? Now, we think the sensor data that DHS is gonna have access to and that CISA already has access to is super important for our operational relevance and our operational opportunities. But in the true censoring, the sense of putting sensors out on the edge, we are divesting as the business, we are divesting from that in real time. But what I would say is this, I actually think the federal government is quite good at tactical information sharing for potential victimization at single victims, right? If we have the name of a company or an MSP that we can drill down and get to the relevant IP domain and we can say, not that this happened, Adam, you have a problem. We're good there, right? Where we struggle is when we have downstream customers that are in the hundreds or thousands of the primary victim that has been hit. And to scale that quickly and make notifications or to provide tactical warning, whether it's the FBI alone, the FBI and CISA together, is almost impossible. And so the biggest barrier to success is not knowing who to call in 500 or 1,000 different entities, right? And we've received some very recent feedback from the outside counsel world is very, very powerful and rightfully so during a computer intrusion. We've received some recent feedback that we appreciate, which says this, we don't want the FBI or CISA knocking on the door of the company. We want the FBI or CISA to call counsel. That's fine, but that's also not efficient, right? So I think there's a lot of real life human-related variables in that space that make what we would define as the Holy Grail potentially not possible in the short term.
No. Carol, do you have any thoughts about that? I think, from a national security perspective at the highest levels, having that kind of visibility would be critical. What do you think about it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. White House leadership, including the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech, Ann Neuberger, constantly would highlight the fact that we need visibility proportional to the potential impact of the system going down or of the potential malicious activity, which in the case of disruptive cybercrime like ransomware means potentially potentially bringing down a pipeline. And then, of course, like intellectual property theft and other things that can have massive consequences for our economy. So I think you're right. Real-time info sharing is critical. We want that visibility. We've pointed to that in things even like sanctions guidance that OFAC published, highlighting that if you make a ransom payment to a designated person, they'll consider whether or not you cooperated with and shared information with law enforcement and CISA as a mitigating factor for bringing an enforcement action and sanctions. And then, of course, also trying to find other ways to share valuable information out with industry to point to the value of being able to work with us. Like I'm sure with the work that FBI did in recovering certain proceeds in the wake of certain incidents, like if there was no information sharing or partnership from industry, like that would be very difficult. Like I think that there's a lot that we want to continue to do and reinforce about the value that we provide, but the issues that Brian spoke to about this reticence to want to share information, I think we even see it in the incident reporting legislation that was just approved. There are certain restrictions around use for law enforcement purposes or regulatory purposes, which means that the information that I'm sure that was based on stakeholder engagement and concerns from industry, that they didn't want that information to be able to be leveraged potentially against them. Of course, I'm curious to see if that will ultimately hinder the ability to hold accountable certain actors and provide us the necessary visibility that we need to deter this activity and hold accountable these criminals in the first place. So I don't know, there's a lot of interesting issues like this reticence to share information with law enforcement until they've consulted with counsel. I know it's about trust, it's about figuring out how the information is going to be used. So you're right, a lot of human factors, concerns about risk, reputational risk, and geopolitical risk. But we need that visibility. Otherwise, how else can we take sufficient action in order to mitigate the potential impacts across a critical sector? Or in the case of North Korean actors stealing $500 million in cryptocurrency, how can we stop those funds from going to fund proliferation activities for a rogue regime?
Yeah.
Adam, can I jump in about Colonial real quick, just for the group's knowledge? I try to hit some best practices when I'm at these because I think it's important. One thing Colonial did really, really well in the first 24 hours, about at the 24-hour mark, is they said all U.S. government requests for information and answers back to the U.S. government will flow through DOE, okay, through Department of Energy. That was a little bit unique to us because TSA is their SMRMA, but that's fine. That's their decision. We are happy to attach to whatever apparatus and whatever the ingress and egress point is from your perspective that is right for you. And I think that was a really good decision by Colonial very early on that really maximized the efficient flow of information. And just for a little bit of entertainment perhaps, some of the struggles we deal with information flow on our side, I'll speak for myself, I have had attorneys say to me, we don't want you to get the ransom back because it's going to screw up the entire insurance process. And I'm like, all right, but like, where do we fall out on the side of right and wrong, right? I mean, so my point in saying that is a really complex set of circumstances and variables we're all trying to work through.
Can I just one thing about legal counsel and slowing everything down? I mean, you really got to ask. Those are discussions that can happen before the storm hits.
Yep.
Yeah.
If your company has a mindset that it's not if, but when this happens, why shouldn't you have those discussions on the front end? Because, any help you request, you're on the clock, as Brian has said before. I just don't think we should accept that everything's going to work out well in extremis when things go wrong. And I think that's something that we need to work on.
Yeah, amen. Just to footnote that, I will say that if you have responsibility over networks that include any kind of industrial control systems, and you're not using the Colonial attack as a jump-off point to pressure test all of your incident response plans and how your top executives have visibility into what those cascading activities are from deployment of your incident response plans and understanding what you do as leaders of technologists and safeguarding the network, you should. You absolutely should. Because if there's a shareholder derivative suit or something else, if you're subject to a similar attack and you haven't, you're going to really wish you had. Anyway, Beth, sort of real-time information sharing. Are there any best practices you've seen in government on the real-time as opposed to kind of the process-driven?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have the Homeland Security Information Network, which is actually, we have communities of interest there, and CISA has several locations there, and they go across the spectrum in the United States, right? State, local, tribal, and territorial, as I mentioned, other government agencies and other stakeholders. We found that to be incredibly useful, so useful in fact that we're going to modernize that whole platform this year, and we've just gotten some technology modernization funding because they all see the value in that platform for information. That is real time. And we found that to be particularly effective in incident response information sharing. But I'll go back to what I said previously too. Much of it is relationship building, right? And knowing who your counterparts are in various, particularly federal agencies, but even in some state and local large communities, it's helpful to know who's doing what in those areas. And I think to the point that was made about preparation, right? Have the conversation. Somebody said, well, the sun is shining. That's great because that's exactly when those conversations need to happen. And keeping track of who are my new points of contact. I know at DHS we in the IT community we move around a lot, and so knowing who's who in the zoo is incredibly important. And you need to know that before the incident happens. And but I will say those information sharing platforms that have been around for a period of time, and they're in various levels of, clearance and et cetera. But just at the unclassified level, I would offer that that Homeland Security Information Network is a pretty broad information sharing platform. Yeah, boy, and Jane in her presentation, the premium corporations are looking for in their CISOs that those soft skills and EQ, because how much of our effectiveness is driven by relationships and trust, right? To achieve outcomes, I mentioned Brian, he's terrific at it, but just to really build that confidence and develop that relationship, so you're ready to take a risk because it's relationship driven. So something that I think was a subject of another panel, and they went deep into it, but it's something that I've always selfishly wanted to know from government leaders, and so I'm going to ask it here. The supply chain issues, and Matt, this is a great one for you, but Brian will put you on the spot, and you're going to wince here because I will tell you I got this from an unclassified forum.
Was it my testimony?
But it was not your testimony. Okay. But it might have been in your testimony, I don't know. So the PLA has 22,000 vendors, and those vendors do business globally, and many of those vendors are doing business with our companies, right? So there's one step of removal between the vendors we interact with and the PLA, right? If you think of it that way. How can government help us when we're talking about, and we had this conversation in the other roundtable, we are buying through assurances, software, hard firmware, devices with the assurance that they're entirely the code is entirely developed in the United States. Well, those coders in the US are using freeware. The freeware is developed sometimes in Russia, right? So without having to reverse engineer everything we do, without having to divine all of that reality ourselves, how can government help us with the supply chain threat that's on everyone's mind after SolarWinds?
Okay, let me give you an easy example. I used this in my opening remarks today. I think the evolution of the threat is really concerning, and so the example I use, which I think is easy to understand, is this. What happens when the adversary becomes surgically precise in targeting and realizes that, for example, one piece of software controls the entire commercial real estate closing industry in the United States? And that's a software as a service platform that has patches pushed proactively, no different than any other software we use. The evolution of that threat and the tied to the precision of the targeting is really, really concerning. When I think about the supply chain threat, it's largely, not entirely, but largely a DoD classified supply chain threat. And understanding the injects from all the subs from the DIB primes is really, really challenging. So the only thing that I can offer you, Adam, is to say that our information sharing with the DIB primes and encouraging the DIBs to map their downstream network is extremely, extremely important, and that's something we do on a regular basis, but it's just not the Bureau. NSA is having those conversations, Cyber Command, CIA, CISA as well. Sometimes we're together, sometimes it's unilateral based on classification of the contracts. So the thing that we can do the most is share IOCs, TTPs, monikers, et cetera, other supply chain vulnerabilities. And I think the uniqueness that the Bureau has is through our counterintelligence statutory authorities. And we see IP theft, and we see proliferation cases, and pushing that back into the intelligence cycle to the DIB primes and downstream is probably the most important thing that we do and that we can do.
Yeah. Matt, what about in the GDIT world? That has to be one of your top concerns.
Oh, it is, but also remember in the GDIT world, our world is people, just as much as technology. So we have to work on the insider threat as well as the challenges that come with working across a diverse skill sets all over the place. At the same time, looking at the people who we do partner with all the way down. Now, the challenge we have is not just in the DIB and DIB plus prime world, it's also forced labor sanctions. There are products that come into these pipelines that have non-national security, but yet national security implications that can get you just as much trouble. And so we're trying to make sure that we scrutinize every ring all the way down. And a lot of that does fall on open records and open source, because the challenge is that there's some things the federal government doesn't have on companies that just aren't located here, or that it's mom and pop level that you just don't have that level of documentation. So we rely on open source. We count on that to give us that warm fuzzy, if you will, on these are the right people to work with for our mission space. And then we interrogate it from there. So it's a trust but verify model, but it has to be that way right now because we can't have a bad day in our world.
Yeah, yeah.
Adam, can I have one note that Matt just triggered in my head? We had a meeting with a bunch of PE firms. This is not FBI unilateral with the interagency. And it was really, really eye-opening to me when we talked about hiring practices of those private equity firms in China for China expansion businesses or for China investment in the United States. To Matt's point, the ability to vet that talent is almost non-existent. And because of that, the risk is through the roof. And that is a huge gap in our collective ability to inform private sector or for private sector have a really meaningful way to do that work on a routine basis to protect investment. So that just triggered that thought in my mind.
Yeah.
If it's all right, since I know you guys covered the DIB and those issues well, but I did want to at least point to the fact that I think the government is trying to do a lot to provide information into the hands of industry that can help broadly on supply chain beyond just the tactical information sharing, which is so critical, especially when we know about it. Sometimes that is applied through government, like exclusive processes, basically like CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. But there's also, the NIST guidance that's gone out for supply chain risk management. The NTIA, they operate the C-SCRIP. I think it's the supply chain risk management in ICT communication systems working group where they have a mailing list with trusted providers so that they share information with to highlight like information around grants and funding and SBOM information and other things that can be useful for the ICT community to be able to secure their supply chain. The FAA works through, there's their version of an ISAC. It's called ASIAS, and I can't remember what the acronym is, but they share information on like parts integrity for the aviation sector to help make sure, because I think that there's just an understanding that if one plane goes down, it's not a competitive advantage for another airline. Like everyone wants parts integrity and quality information to be able to be shared. So they operate that ISAC for supply chain information. There's a lot of different tools that are out there to support broader supply chain templates and approaches to how you want to approach vendor and personnel screening. It's supply chain risks related to quality, integrity, physical security, cybersecurity. So please know that there are a lot of resources that are out there that can help your organizations. And then of course the government continuing to look where we can share and declassify information that we know when there are specific threats that raise their heads.
Excellent. So Matt touched on people, and I want to go there. And Eric, I'm going to shoot this one to you. So Eric and I worked on, in the twilight of our FBI careers before we both retired, we worked on a project for the director to study the operating model of the FBI, to really sort of move it out of the post 9/11 model to what was coming. And I think we both agreed that the digital era was going to really define the FBI's mission for the next probably 50 years, right? Until there's another threat that we don't understand out there. And now that we're both in critical infrastructure, I see a situation on the insider threat front where we need engagement from government and we need better information sharing. I think the information sharing is excellent and it's probably going to be bureau information sharing. But we, for example, reside in Virginia. Well, Virginia Tech, fantastic school, happens to be the hypersonics UAV research facility for DoD, most heavily funded. There was enough activity there that we built a SCIF out on the campus. It's a hotbed of activity. Leave it there. And yet, if you are a company who wants the best engineers in the area, where do you go to recruit, right? And so when we're thinking about insider threat and the sophistication in our programs necessary to identify folks leveraging tradecraft whose collection resides up here, they don't even have to steal anything. They're working in it all day long, right? And when we identify somebody through our user behavior analytics, through changes in access control patterns or whatever it is, hopefully we have technology enabling us to have visibility into that. And again, if there is no argument for converged security, it is the worst case scenario of insider threat activity, nation state activity within your company. And if you don't have an understanding of what's on the other side of that classified threshold, you don't know exactly what you're dealing with those folks. So you will have the first part of it. You will have the abnormal activity. Your employment, they know how to use employment rules, so you can't identify folks based on national origin or anything else, citizenship or whatever. So if you have a workforce of 25,000 people, you're trying to find that needle in a haystack. You can use those automated tools to identify a class of folks that are doing things that are outside of the ordinary course. How do we get the information we need on the other side of that to identify who those folks are? Eric, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think you framed the question exactly right. We have part of the tapestry, and without knowing what the other side may directly be, they may go after a smaller utility like PGE, but it's because we're an easy conduit into somebody bigger. But we may not know exactly what they're after and when. And we can have all of the technology in to look at anomalies of what's going on, DLP and other tools, but we're kind of throwing punches in the dark if we don't have that information of specifically what they're targeting. We can think in our minds what our crown jewels are. We may set up, our architecture and our processes to defend those. But again, without necessarily knowing what the latest, how they're coming at us, our systems are used against us. And, like we've talked before, is we have a whole of government adversary in China against the divide that exists between public and private sector, and then throw in a little political divide that we may have. And we are sort of a babe in the woods. So how do we close that gap in real time? What do those conversations look like? So it deals with HR, it deals with legal issues, but I think we're terribly exposed on that front.
Beth, what do you think? I mean, you're getting the attacks from afar. What about attacks from within?
So we have a robust insider threat program that is really a partnership between the chief security officer and the CIO. And aside from the fact that it's one of those things that gives you nightmares, because just as an anecdotal piece, years ago, several decades ago, my father worked at General Electric Research and Development, right? He worked in the computer room. And he worked shift work, and he saw somebody who was not a U.S. national, who was making copies, a bunch of copies, carrying all his paper out and reported it. And it turned out to be a foreign national stealing from General Electric. Now, this is 40 plus years ago. If you think about just that very simple example, this is one of the things I worry about is just how easy it is. And unfortunately, I think all the fabulous tools that we have that point to anomalous behavior, they're forensic, right? To your point about the collection mechanism is here, and they're walking out the door, and we don't know the minute they walk out the door who they've spoken to, what they've sent in a message. So it's frightening. We do the very best we can, but I think it got said yesterday, right, when we were talking about supply chain risks and all of the variety of, it's going to happen, right? So know what your assets are, right? Know what the potential is that's going to be taken and what could potentially be done with it, and just recognize and start from it's going to happen, and not from how do I stop it from happening, and what are your mitigation strategies, and what are your, back to the planning pieces of it and the practice pieces of it. If this kind of information is exfiltrated, then what happens, and how do we respond to that? And I think we just, as professionals, have been around long enough to recognize that these threats, that the ones that are going to get us are the ones that we're not anticipating today. So if we just start from, my perspective is just start from the fact that it's going to happen, right, and then work backwards from there.
I think another challenge is the cultural one, where a lot of times people say, it wouldn't happen here, it wouldn't happen to us, and we don't have that holistic where, again, we've got all components that would touch it, whether CSO, CISO, HR. I mean, do we have that holistic, and then do we have enhanced monitoring? How much will the culture of the company abide by, what they would sometimes see as a big brother culture? But it's, don't fall victim to it because you didn't think about it. If you decide to set your balance point with your company, culture, fine, but don't get caught because you didn't think about the worst case scenario.
Right.
Well, and I want to turn over to Carol because I being the FBI executive in charge of that territory, I will tell you, Virginia Tech was an outstanding partner and had a keen awareness of the importance of the work that they were doing. But there were other universities that, when the FBI showed up, you were welcomed by a shanty town built by the students, and they're protesting your presence. Is there an awareness at the policy level that industry is facing this? I mean, it's an obvious point, but is there something that they can do to inform that side of it?
So I think it does get it gets to some very sensitive information, of course, when you're dealing with specific people. You mentioned HR and legal issues, but yes, like we see all the different vectors where tech transfer and threats are coming from, whether externally for intellectual property theft or otherwise infiltrating organizations. So I think that that's something that we continue to look at in agencies beyond just FBI, but also the others that Brian spoke to in the IC, continue to look at if there's ways that we can either take action or if there's anything that we can share. But yeah, I think it really just feeds back into all the issues that I talked about before, about if we can declassify things and share them, then great. If not, then we provide the guidance that we can on personnel vetting, on insider threats, on the role that plays in supply chain, and thinking about the personnel processes and policies all behind it, which are pointed to and like in the NIST guidance and everything that I pointed to before. So I don't have anything more to give you, I'm afraid, right now.
Adam, can I add one note about the classification? If any of you ever are told by anybody at the FBI we can't share that because it's classified, call me personally. We will overcome that very quickly. The only things we can overcome are if it's derived from NSA or CIA, collect that, or a foreign government. That can be challenging, but we can usually parallel reconstruct. That's old bureau, right? You get that answer, I want a call to fix that immediately.
All right, so we have 5 minutes left on the clock, so I want to invite any questions. You know the drill. We've got the mic somewhere. I started with Brian. I think I want to ask you, and I want to ask you this the way that you'll answer it appropriately, right? Does the FBI, because after 9/11, the FBI attuned to the terrorism threat. And rightly so, it was an existential threat. It was something that the nation rallied around. Our policymakers were smart to it because it was a kinetic attack that they had to face. Now in 2022, I think certainly everyone in this room would say that the greatest threat to the United States is nation-state attacks on its infrastructure and stealing its intellectual property, and everything that comes at us from the cyber vector does the greatest degree of damage, right? Mm-hmm. Are we moving in the right direction to get the resources we need, to have enabling work on the Hill so that you have the authorities that you need? The partnerships, I think, from my perspective, they're better than they've ever been. Where's it going?
Yep. Let me hit on, I promised a few folks in the audience a few comments about China. So let me take that, jump off, and I'll answer your question. So in China, the situation in China is horrible, right, in terms of doing business over there. And if you want me to be more descriptive than that, I would say it's really, really bad, right? I mean, it's just, they are beyond disciplined. You have to assume that if you're doing business there, either in the R&D stage or in the steady state business stage, that every piece of data that comes into and out of that country is siphoned off by the Chinese government. That is absolutely true. It is the definition of how they do business. Our message to people relative to China is simply this: you have to understand your risk tolerance for loss. That is a you decision, that is a board decision, but the exposure to loss is there and will always be there. Anybody that needs a little bit more to watch on this, just Google Made in Beijing. It's free, 30 minutes, goes through several companies who lost their entire IP to the Chinese government, and a really good, quite frankly, a really good short video to show to a board to scope the threat. So to Adam's question, are we going in the right direction? I think we have a cardinal direction, but as in any business process, as an industry matures, right, things start to consolidate down and people, organizations start to find their mission space. And I think we're still in a little bit of a messy who owns what space right now. And I think it's very pronounced at the different recruiting and retention incentive levels that have afforded certain opportunities to certain agencies and not others. So I will say it this way. For all of you who have relationships with people on the Hill or influencers or centers of gravity in the community, I would ask for two considerations. Under this veil, how do we grow the team together? Because the team is only as strong as its weakest part. And so if we all have individual authorities that are complementary and individual capabilities that are complementary, we have to grow the team in parallel. And right now that is not happening based on retention and recruiting incentives that have been given to some agencies and not others. And I think that's really unfair to the American public. The second point of consideration I would have for all of you is with the passing of the incident reporting legislation, many of us, myself included, think that's a very, very productive step forward. It is going to change the speed at which information flows into the federal government. Okay, right now, CISA and the Bureau may get a call at the 8-hour mark. My conversations with attorneys says that once that becomes law, they will wait to the 72-hour mark to report because that's what the legislation asks for. So as we think about how to change that paradigm in the future, one point of consideration is this: as supply chain attacks increase, they will. CERCIA, which is the law, is silent on whether a victim has an ethical or legal mandate to inform their downstream customers about the compromise of their data as the primary victim. My ethical read of that is you will always notify your downstream customers if their data has been compromised, but the law doesn't require that. And I would ask all of you to champion that effort, because if we're gonna approach it as a whole, a team sport, we have to include downstream victims as victims being notified by the primary upstream victim. So I'll end there.
And Adam, if I may, we had some ex-FBI, as an ex-CISA person and someone who's told Bob I'm going to commit him to at least one thing because I'm an ex-CISA alum. The whole incident reporting and information sharing game has to be viewed as proactive, Right now, because we're thinking about incidents, we're thinking about recovery, we're thinking about it in the way of historical, and that's the problem we've got to turn. If information sharing is going to be successful, it has to be seen as proactive. Yeah. And from a CISA perspective, the incident reporting is more, not necessarily, sadly, for the victim, but for no future victims. And so that model is what had to do it. And we saw a trend in about 2016, 2017, where there's a stigma. If you got ransomware popped, you felt guilty that your IT was bad or your cyber practices were bad. It was your fault.
Yeah.
Fast forward, everybody assumes they're getting ransomware popped.
Right.
So it's different now. The stigma has been moved, but there has to be maintain that value on the information sharing to keep that momentum going.
I think that's a credit to government too, because I think the messaging on it has changed and it gives us cover in that. So I have 2 points. I know I'm out of time. 2 points I have to make. One real quick. If you don't stick around for EDU's presentation tomorrow, you have not you've not used everything out of this conference that you should, because I've seen it. It will curl your toes. That's all I gotta say. Secondly, Brian, I know the size of the job that you have. We've heard from CSIPs, we've heard from partner agencies. We know what kind of job you're doing. Can't say enough about my respect for you, and the Hunter Biden shot you took on the Hill was a cheap shot. That's all I'm going to say about that.
I don't know where the laptop is, and I haven't found it yet, right?
That was a cheap shot.